Yeah, thank you both for having me. Thank you everybody for coming through. As Kelly mentioned, I'm a visual artist, Los Angeles native. I've been in the Bay Area for quite some time now. I'm also an arts educator, and I got out of class not that long ago. So, and welcome to my studio here in West Oakland, where I also teach. This has also been my classroom for the last year. So, thank you everybody for coming through.
Cool. And then I guess we could dive right in to talking about the work. If everybody can see the slides, kind of maybe nod your head if you see this slide and scrolling a little bit. Okay, cool.
We're good.
So this actually just a grab of the viewing room main page with some links added on the side. Like I said earlier, if people are joining late, there are links posted in the chat, which I'll post up again periodically and also at the end of our meeting. Anna, why don't you proceed?
Okay, so we're starting here with one of the works from the Erase series, which we'll get to talking more in depth about in a minute. But I just wanted to get, Pablo, your like a general sense, if you could talk about what you see as the issues at stake in your practice as a whole.
So I guess just to make sure I understood your question, like what is sort of like the basic premise behind the work, like what I do?
Yeah, like what's your impetus for making work?
I guess, there's a sort of an innate need to express myself visually. So I think just as a person, I'm a maker of things. So I very much need to make things. And but also what drives my work is the ideas or the content in the work. And so most of the work, if not entirely all the work, is really questioning systems of power, questioning the status quo, and really trying to like look at these counter hegemonic narratives. So I really try to pick apart this, like a lot of us understand as the dominant narrative in American society, and then make work through that lens. And more specifically, really through the lens of a Latin American uh, person who is a child of immigrants.
That was my second question, is like about your background and how that informs your practice.
Yeah, I think, as an LA native, both my parents are immigrants. And so my American identity is something that I've really been unpacking for quite some time. And even though I moved away from LA at a very young age, it's been very clear everywhere I go that I am in some way or another an ambassador of LA culture. And so much of what informs my practice is my experience as a Los Angelino, as someone who grew up in LA, and very specifically in the community that I grew up in, surrounded by the people I grew up in. So, um, you know, a large majority of the people I grew up with are Chicano or Mexican American or Pan Latin Americans, and there's a very specific experience that I'd say is very unique to California and very unique to LA. And I think that's something that is very much at the core of my fibers, the fabric of who I am as a person. So even though I haven't lived in LA for quite some time, it's very much part of the work that I make. It's very much part of the visual vocabulary that I use. I was a graffiti writer for a long time, and so all of these things are things that are part of the work.
When you talk about the California culture, and what is specific to that as like being an immigrant and having the immigrant experience as a Californian versus the immigrant experience that we would have in New York, say? Is there something that's like radically specific about it that you're tapping into?
Yeah, I mean, I think like in terms of like regional differences, so much of the California identity is very much in relationship with the uh, the Mexican border. And so much of Mexican culture is such a big part of the history of the land that we live on, and also the Native American tribes that were here before everything. So there are some very specific things that have to do with the region itself and that have shaped all of the major cities here in the Southwest, but most specifically Los Angeles. And my parents and the world that I saw as a young person was very diverse, but there was a very big part of our lives that had to do with relationships with other immigrant family, or people that sort of were living a similar experience. Um, there was a shared language. So, especially very much in the early days, that was a very big part of our lives. And then I was very fortunate enough to have a very diverse experience. So I met people from all kinds, all backgrounds. But, when I moved away from Los Angeles, I was able to really understand the unique culture of not just the city of LA, but very specifically like the region of LA that I was growing up around, which was what we call the gateway of the San Gabriel Valley and East Los Angeles. Both were very big parts of my life, which are neighborhoods that are East Los Angeles is predominantly Latin American neighborhood. Um, and then Alhambra, where I grew up a lot. Most of my life has changed radically in many ways in terms of the different immigrant populations that are there. But yeah, so that all of those experiences were very much part of what informs my work.
Great. You talked a little bit about graffiti as a background part of your younger experience. With, I think it was in one of our videos that we have, or maybe you mentioned it just a moment ago. How does that relate to the work that you're making today? And I sort of thinking about that as we start to talk about the Erase series, and we see some visual representations of erasure of different kinds of images, and wondering how you transformed and kept some of that graffiti culture and moved it into the fine art sort of MFA, like professional artist world, and where you see that sort of existing in contemporary art.
So I think like something that's important to recognize is that my career as a professional artist, or in quote a fine artist, is a fairly recent trajectory. I've been making things, and people have known me as an artist since I was a very young person. But I was pretty much I mean, I wasn't very interested in the commercial art world. The cultural institutions didn't really speak to me because the artwork, for the large part, didn't speak to me. Because a large part of it was, made by, what we call pale, male, and stale lens. So I wasn't very interested in the work. I mean, I could go in there and really become interested in the craftsmanship and in the painting itself, but and the content of the work wasn't really speaking to me. The narratives, the people in it. So I was a very committed graffiti writer for years, and it's been a large part of my life since I was very young. And so I wasn't really interested in having, I guess, like a traditional art career for a very long time. And it wasn't until I moved here to the Bay Area when I decided to go to graduate school. I guess I should also mention I didn't study art as an undergraduate either.
Right. Yeah, I know that you were going into sciences, and then you made the switch. So I'm
Yeah, well,
interested in that too. Like, what was the impetus for that switch from doing something in science based? Because I myself made a similar switch.
yeah, I think for me, I went to an arts high school, which saved my life. My mom and my stepfather were very supportive of my interest in art, even though even though it was at the time when I look back on it, I'd say it was a difficult thing for my parents to be supportive of what was criminal activity in a large way, but still very supportive of my creative practice. And going to the arts high school in a lot of ways saved my life, expanded my horizons and just my understanding of the world and in the way that I worked. And so I think I was just like I said, I wasn't really interested in following a traditional path as an artist. I didn't really feel like wearing the title artist. I just I kept making things. I never stopped drawing. I never stopped painting. I was painting a lot of walls. I was still very active in the graffiti scene, but I was also doing some legal murals as people saw my artwork and became interested in myself and my friends painting different walls. And when I ended up going to college, for me, I just really wanted to expand my knowledge of the world. So I was
Hmm.
very much invested in social justice issues. So I ended up studying environmental science, sustainable development specifically, and my interest was mostly related to sustainable agriculture in urban areas. And but my focus was always about social justice. So that to me is a thread that's always been part of my has been part of my upbringing in my household. Has been part of the path I've had as an artist. I've always been a practitioner of resistance culture. I've always been very much aware of this dominant narrative that didn't really speak to myself, my community, and other people that come from marginalized communities. So I think as a graffiti writer, there was a large part of that kind of resistance happening at the time. But what I really needed was to develop my intellect and be able to expand on my ideas. And like I said, I never stopped painting. I never stopped drawing. I just had no interest in being part of a commercial gallery system at the time. And then many years passed. I continued to paint, and there was a lot of people that kept asking me why I didn't consider participating a little bit more in this world or in this arena. And so it took many years, to be honest. It took many years for me to be okay with that idea. And I ended up applying to graduate school, and I got into a couple programs, and that's how I ended up here in the Bay Area, or staying here in the Bay Area, and really investing some time in a studio practice. I had never really given myself the time to develop my painting practice inside of a studio and sort of take a look at what my artwork would look like if I put down the spray paint, or not necessarily put it down, but just kind of make work in a different way for potentially a different audience, for a different venue. Um, and I think each creative person, everybody has their own path. So I as a teacher, I talk about these kind of things with my students,
Hmm.
because I don't necessarily encourage them to go straight to an art school. I'm not a person that believes that you have to go to art school to be an artist.
Hmm.
I'm not one that pushes any of those ideas. So for me, this came back to me in my life, and once I decided to follow this as a career, it's when and I would say this started. I went to grad school between 2007 and 2009, so I feel like that was really sort of the beginning of my professional art career.
Hmm.
Prior to that, I was in some exhibits here and there, and I had painted many, many walls, and I was definitely what people would consider an artist, but I didn't necessarily call myself that. But that's sort of how I got to where I am today.
I guess that bleeds into talking about the erase series, I'm saying it as erase because you do this word play with it's erase, but it's erase. And I'm interested in the word play with that, and also how uh, how you came about with the decision to call them this erase, and if you could talk a little bit about that series,
Oh yeah, yeah,
which we're
absolutely.
looking at now, some of the images now.
Yeah, and like the work that you're looking at least some of these examples span years. It's a body of work I've been kind of chipping away at for maybe like a decade. I think the first time I started doing work like this was maybe like in well, I don't know, even like before my grad school days. So maybe even like the portfolio that I built for graduate school. So
Hmm.
I'd say maybe 2006, maybe was the first time I started, like messing around with these kind of this like visual vocabulary that you're looking at. As a graffiti writer, the city, like all major cities, not just the city of LA, but especially because I've been here in the Bay Area for so long now. But any city becomes like my muse, where the textures of an urban environment become like like visual poetry. And so a large part of the inspiration of my work is sort of like borrowing these relationships that I see out in the street. And as a graffiti writer, I think I see the world in a very specific way. And this is not like unique or unusual to, many of my friends who are artists that have a similar background to mine, we sort of see the world in a very similar way. And this kind of to me, it's like a metaphor. This desire or need to paint your name or to express yourself on the walls of this city, and then different organizations or the city itself comes to paint whatever you did, paint it over, and then people come back to paint on top of that, and there's this constant back and forth, which to me is this interesting uh, kind of power dynamic between voices in a city or in a society. And so I wanted to kind of recreate that sort of feeling and idea, and talk about the erasing of people's voices, the erasing of histories, the erasing of cultures, the erasing of truth. There's so many ways that we can fold
Yeah.
that dough into this into this bread, I guess, that I'm talking about. And so it just became kind of like a way to work and to talk about different events that were happening, different ideas. And also kind of what I really missed as a graffiti writer in my studio practice was the immediacy of everything. When I'm out in the street painting, I don't really have a plan. I don't really care who sees it, who doesn't see it. I'm just doing
Hmm.
my own thing. And so when I came into my studio, a lot of that kind of raw energy it was disappearing. So
Mm.
this was sort of a natural way to kind of bring it back into the work, and then start talking about these social justice issues, and to talk about these things that were very important to me. And but and it goes back to kind of the bigger umbrella of what my work is about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're going to switch for Kelly, who's driving here,
Yeah.
and talk a bit about your sculptures. Um,
Let me just barge in a little bit.
yeah.
For anybody who's joined in late or later, no one's late. You're all on time. Um, we're in a artist talk with Pablo Cristi, and this is the Black Ball Projects, and we just want to talk about Pablo's work. And this is our first live event, and we have Pablo's viewing room live on our website, which is posted in the chat. If you can't see that, then we're going to repost the links. And also later on, shortly, we're going to take some questions. Feel free to pencil in any questions into the chat, and that'll give sort of a queue of topics we can pick up towards the end. But until then, we're just going to keep talking about the work that's on the site. And go ahead, Anna.
Great. So I love this piece. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. I did want to ask you just specifically, are these hands doing a gang symbol?
Well, I mean, it depends. It depends. I guess it could be, but in this specific case, it's very specifically referencing
Oh,
West Coast hip hop culture. So those are W's. Yes, they are. They are alluding to gang signs. The bigger project did have some more specific gang signs, but this one specifically, it started with this. West Coast hip hop culture. So as a graffiti writer, I was part of a crew. I was part of various crews, and we were all contributors to a very big hip hop movement that was happening in all over the world, really. But we were based in LA, and we were representing Los Angeles and the West Coast very specifically. So this symbol became something that was very commonly used between us and like in our world, which was at the time less accessible. I'd say was not as mainstream as it's become. You know, we've
Mm.
seen graffiti art go in and out of these cycles of popularity in this more mainstream world. You know, like with a lot of those New York graffiti writers in the '70s and in the early '80s and their presence in the fine art galleries. And then we saw another cycle of that in the early '90s in LA and across the world. And so, you know, this was sort of like a prototype and sort of an entryway to some of the other projects where I was sort of poking fun at the curatorial aspect of bringing street culture into these institutions. And like you sort of looking at like culture as commodity. So I wanted to sort of start playing around with those ideas, and I kind of wanted to fold in this like lowbrow and highbrow culture, like low culture and high culture. You know, so even though this looks like gold, it's, you know, actually just spray paint, right? So and like I'd say even in all the work, I'm just kind of pointing in a direction. I'm not necessarily saying anything specific. I'm just bringing these different things together. And to me, what's more interesting is hearing people discuss the work, because what it exposes is different people's relationships to what they're looking at. And I think that to me is where the most interesting stuff is happening. That's actually almost more the art to me, is because
Conversations surrounding how the artist, the object, the audience,
that's
like
right.
that interaction, that triad.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And you know, and you know, clearly here in this group and in this conversation, people have access to the person that made the work, so I can give you a little bit more background to it. But you know, if you're just seeing it in like a gallery setting or whatever, you're just, you know, you're just having that experience with it. So yeah. So anyways, this project itself was you know, about West Coast hip hop culture and specifically the mixed tape kind of world that I, you know, was involved in. So, you know, back then, you know, I'm sure a lot of you remember this. We used to do mixtapes for ourselves, but also for our friends.
I
But
don't think our younger viewers might not know what that is, but
yeah, well, I don't know how many young people are in here, but yeah.
but you know, it's in general, you know, now it's a definitely a
So,
throwback.
one of my duties though, not just my own but other graffiti writers out there, like, you know, we would hook up the tape, like the cover of the tape, we would put artwork on it, you know. And at the
Mhm.
time we were doing a lot of flyers for like house parties,
Yeah,
or painting like wood panels and decorating for like underground parties that were happening. You know, people, you know, ditch parties, people would ditch school, we would go to these different places and we'd be part of this. You know, it was a whole scene. You know, it
yeah, yeah,
wasn't just us, you know, the DJs, B-boys,
yeah.
MCs. So, but yeah, for me, very specifically, I used to get a lot of other people's mixtapes, like friends of mine that were DJs, and I would hook them up for whoever, you know, somebody they liked, or for my friends, anybody, you know. So this is like a very kind of, I guess, more personal in terms of like my own experience and at that time.
With respect to the sculptures, and we're going to move on from this one, but in general, are these one ofs, or do you do them as molds where you're making like a multiple?
Hmm.
I
These
mean, these
ones,
seems that the pig feet seem to be a collection, and
yeah. So
that's like
like,
one piece, right?
yeah.
And but the hands are sort of these individual
Mhm.
things, and I don't know if that you made multiples of the hands or if that was a one of.
So the hands and the pig feet themselves all are, the molds are made out of dermagel. So they're one time only
Mm,
used. So each one of these objects I had to make individually. Um, so there, I mean, I made multiples of them, but I had to recreate the mold. It's, you know, labor intensive,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah. But it wasn't
and
using like a mold that you have you sort of in stock that you could then go, "Oh, I'm going to go back and remake this piece from this mold again and again and
that's right.
again."
That's right.
Okay.
Well, the only thing here that is that was reproducible is if you go up the cassette tape. The original mold of that was latex. Oh, and I forgot to mention. I know. I mean, this is silly little detail, but that tape, the original, is a actual real mixed tape that I found inside of a vehicle of mine, like 3 vehicles ago. That melted. It melted.
In the sun
Is
outside.
that why it's all like it's a little warpy?
Yeah, it melted in the Los Angeles heat, and
Yeah.
but I didn't want to throw it away. I just kept it as this artifact,
Yeah.
and so I made an artifact from the artifact.
Yeah.
That's
Wonderful.
how that
Yeah.
ended up becoming. But yeah, that one, that mold I can reuse. But everything else, these hands, I had to make them individually in
Mm.
Dermagel. And for those people that don't know what Dermagel is, it's if you ever have been to the dentist and they've done a mold of your teeth, same thing, same
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, but once you use it, you destroy it. I mean, to
Yeah.
get the thing out of there, you have to rip
Yes.
the whole thing apart.
Kel, can you scroll down to the pink hand? Oh, let's talk before we get to the
Oh
pink
yeah,
hands. Let's
the
talk
burritos.
about the burritos. The
Those are
gold
porcelain.
burritos.
Yeah, those are porcelain burritos that were spray painted, and also the kind of that intersection between like lowbrow, highbrow, and these were early on. I did these maybe I think in 2009 or 2000. Yeah, I think 2009. So these, I wanted to talk about like kind of the economy of food and of street food, and still also like this like culture as commodity. And I wanted to sort of allude to like these gold bricks, like burritos.
Yeah.
Like everybody loves burritos. Like burritos are everywhere, but it becomes this very important part of the economy, and not just like in terms of money, but the economy of culture and what that means and what that looks like. And also like because so much of my work is about cultural hybridity, so like this kind of hybrid situation. At the time I was sort of like nerding out on different things, but one was the introduction of wheat to the Americas and how that changed different cultural practices. And it sort of became this thing that existed in this like liminal space, like culturally and also like in terms of time. And so it was just like the starting points for these ideas. And so I ended up making, at the time I was living in a house that had a kiln. I was very fortunate to have that in my backyard. So I just started making a bunch of stuff out of clay, just to kind of mess around with these different ideas. I'm by no means a master of anything really, but I do mess around and play around with anything that I have access to. So this was sort of a way to start talking about these ideas outside of my painting practice. And what I ended up doing was, because this was part of my MFA project, the next slide down,
Yeah.
I
Kel,
ended
let's go
up,
to it.
I ended up creating this like lowrider paletero cart, which I filled with those burritos for my MFA show. And I had like, there was like a little bit of a performance piece that was happening, where people were wheeling around the burrito cart, selling the burritos. And this is called my burrito volador, the flying burrito cart. And, and this was kind of a cool project to do because it took many hands to make.
Yeah.
So,
There was
you
something of a collaboration with it and to
yeah,
make it. And I also wanted to ask you, with reference to this project specifically, it sort of comes under the category of like almost like a social practice. Do you see your work under that like milieu at all?
I'm
Or
not a big, yeah, I mean, yes.
I don't know where, it's like one of these art terminologies that, people
There
are
you
kind
go.
of feeling
That's where I was
about.
going with this. I
Yeah.
don't like any of these terms. They're all baloney to me. So I'm like, I was a social, practice
So
person before there was a term for it.
exactly.
I leave all those terms out there for all the art fuddy-duddies that want to use them. They can put them on me. It's all good. But yeah, I mean, like technically, yeah, it is part of this like sort of like social practice thing, especially when it's activated in the community. So,
Yeah.
ultimately, like this thing was a prototype for a fleet of lowrider carts that I was going to do. And then I just didn't end up doing it because it required a lot of funding that I
Yeah.
just
Yeah,
didn't get.
which is always an issue.
Um, yeah, it's an issue, but also at the time, when people start to gravitate towards certain things, and I see other artists start to kind of mess around with similar ideas, I tend to steer away at that
Yeah.
point. I'm like, oh, that idea it's over, it's done. Like at the time, I had not seen a lowrider paletero cart, but now you can find, there's dozens of people out there making things that are similar to this.
Yeah.
So, and I made this, I want to say like in 2008 was when I started making it. And Yeah, I mean, again, this was like I feel like a lot of my work, especially the sculptural work, they are like prototypes. I've always wanted to sort of follow up with them and create like a greater body of them. But, there's only so much time, there's only so much money. So,
Kel, can you scroll to the
Yeah,
next image, or
yeah.
wait, no, the hand, the pink hand one.
The
Did
pink
we
hand
not
one,
put that?
is it not in there? I can pull it up. One moment, one moment. I was about to say, Pablo, this is now a classic car, burrito cart.
yeah.
Because I did want it, because we're going to see an image of a pink hand sculpture, and it's existing in the world. You put it into, it was shot outside
Oh,
again.
you're talking about the shot in Joshua Tree. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, shot in the Joshua Tree. And so I was wondering, if do you see that as just like a photo documentation, like where um, the object is going on a journey, on a trip, or does this sort of come into like sort of a play into photography, where the object goes into the world and then you're sort of coming into like maybe a new form of working sculptures in space as photography?
Yeah. Actually, this is just one of those weird things that I forced my family to do with me. If I remember correctly, I forced my parents to come to Joshua Tree with me, and I took some props with me because I'm like a big child, and so I just needed to activate these objects in different ways. Even though like this is like I think one of like maybe three hot pink West Coast hands that I made, but so much of these ideas, because they're connected to the land that I come from, I wanted to somehow relate it back to the land in a more direct way, and also this relationship with color,
Yeah.
just because it's clearly like this,
It's so stark with this hot
yeah,
pink, like
it's,
city item in this
there you go.
rural setting. It's I find it a very intriguing image. Like, and so I was just interested if you were going to be thinking about following up on that kind of work, because I know you move through many different kinds of work. Speaking of which, let's move on to the next group of pieces, the drawings and paintings of the West. Kel.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like and that thing that you just showed, that slide, in addition to like a lot of stuff that I do, I think serve more as like research for me.
Hmm.
um, and that's like one of, I don't know, maybe like 100 photographs, but yeah, I don't know, like I'm not a photographer, but I sure do take a lot of photographs.
Sounds like a photographer to me. I mean, it's all part of the art process, So I think it's, you slip back and forth between so many different media and also different series. And as you told me before, that you come back to series, and that these series sort of don't end, and that things, that now we're looking at work called from the the series called the West. And I guess, you've talked a little bit about what the West means to you, and I guess the question is, what are, within the context of these works, how are they? What are you dealing with reference to the West and Western culture and Westerns, and they have sort of different names, and maybe Kelly, you can scroll through some of them as
Mhm.
Pablo's.
Yeah, I think, you know, like it started with this whole idea of just like the West, like West Coast, and what that meant to me as someone who grew up in LA and from California, and what that just meant, right? And then I started digging a little bit more about the history of the West Coast, and more specifically, the history of my own people. You know, my parents are immigrants that came in the '70s, but there was so my family's from Chile originally. My
They
parents.
were escaping Pinochet, yeah?
Yeah, that's correct. So, but what I didn't know is that there was first immigration of or migration of Chileans was in the during the gold rush time,
Oh,
when a lot of Chileans and Peruvians who had more experience in mining came up to California and have this history here that I had no idea about at the time. And so as I started reading more, researching more, I started to become interested in this sort of older history of the West Coast, and how that related to me, my relationship to the land, my relationship to the place. And so I started watching like Western films. I started researching different organizations that existed in that time. Um, you know, this notion of manifest destiny and like westward expansion. All of these things started to expand in the work itself and in the ideas. Um, and I think at the time, like it was just such a rich time of research for me and learning more about history that I wasn't aware of, that I didn't know of. And so, you know, I was using early Hollywood, especially in relationship to like stereotypes, how Latin Americans were villainized, and you know, very much portrayed as either bandidos or lazy. Rarely were Latin people depicted as like heroes, or you know,
yeah.
educated or whatever. So, you know, I wanted to use all of these examples and kind of flip them on their head, turn them on their head, and flip the power dynamic, and just kind of explore what that meant, what that was. And so that's how a lot of this work that we're looking at started to come around. Buffalo Bill became a character that I started to play around with, because there was all these historic photos of you know, the Wild West show, which was this touring show of what was considered the Wild West culture, and you know, it toured all over the world, and this was what became everyone's education as to what the West was and what this
Mm.
meant. And it's something that I was able to sort of pick apart for all of its very strange and problematic depictions of indigenous people, but also these Western films. Just kind of taking that idea of like the bandido or the villain, and also kind of turning that on its head, because a lot of these individuals that in American history books are depicted as villains or as criminals, in oral tradition or in our communities, a lot of these people are heroes. So it really depends on who you ask. And so a lot of this is really just taking a look at American history, and really questioning it, and really
Yeah.
and in some ways trying to take the power back, and changing the narrative, you know,
Yeah.
flipping the script, as we would
Yeah.
say.
Awesome. Moving on,
Probably,
because
sorry to break in.
go ahead.
This is this part of that series as well? This
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunately, it's a bad slide
yeah,
for
this is
the audience.
off of
I
a video.
apologize. Oh, it's
Yeah.
from a video, but yeah, I mean, you know, this was more of an experimental piece. It didn't have any. There was no goal here other than I was just making something for myself. But yeah, I mean, this is sort of this. I don't know. I mean, I was borrowing imagery from a book about Mesoamerica that was written in the early 1900s, that had these really odd lithographs in them. So I started kind of like borrowing imagery from there because of these odd depictions of Mayan culture that I want to play around with. But then I also, our homie Yeezy made it through there. So it's more just like, it was it was just like kind of a fun little drawing for me to make. Nothing. It's hanging right here in my studio. So
Nice.
I don't think it's going anywhere.
You took the name of the series from Kanye West, right? Is that the idea? Is that
Yeah.
where you got the? Okay. Sorry. That's my joke. That's my joke. Anna,
Um,
go
so
on.
yeah, so now we're moving on into, you've been,
Ooh la la.
your more recent work has been a lot of printmaking,
Yes.
and they're absolutely wonderful. And is this a new space of exploration? What kind of access to a print shop do you have? And are you editioning them, or are they monoprints?
That's a great question. I was having this conversation with my coworker today who, let's see. So my printmaking is sort of a recent development in my life. I would say the last 3 years of my life, I've been doing a lot more printmaking, and I have a lot of prints, and it's not something that I ever would, I don't have them up on my website. They haven't made it into any exhibits. For the most part, you would have to know me and either be around my studio or be around my actively making these things to see them. But I've been exploring just different types of printmaking. A large part of it has really been part of my path as an educator, because we teach young people. I'm part of an awesome crew of visual art educators in downtown Oakland at an arts middle school and high school. And we're kind of a jack of all trades. So if there's something you don't know how to do well, you kind of have to like start practicing and messing around with certain media until you get enough mastery of the medium to be able to teach it. And so, a lot of the foundation is stuff that I'm obviously very familiar with or I've done in the past. But because we have some facilities in our school, we can't, or some, of these tools, it allows me to experiment and allows me to make stuff that I may not normally make. So that's how I arrived at a lot of this work. Some of it has been to be like either demos for my students or examples of how to mix different types of printmaking or how to fold drawing back into your printmaking, mixed media stuff. I'm not really one to follow rules. So these are ways of me experimenting and then being able to bring that back into a classroom setting. But then I end up with like work that I either like or want to recreate the process. So that's how a lot of this stuff happened. Um, yeah.
Well, it's great work. So we're going to scroll down and look at one of your most recent works, and I'm just going to ask you, what have your most recent explorations been with your practice? How are you changing it up or playing with it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think during COVID and just pre-COVID, I just been drawing a lot, just like really getting back into drawing. And I come from a sort of school of this really goes all the way back to our graffiti writing days as young people. LA graffiti styles, especially in the early 90s, there was this sort of school of thought of having to be very clean and crisp with how you drew, how you did your letter forms, but also how you painted, how you laid the paint down. And so it's something that was ingrained in me. And so when I draw, I always had this sort of desire to render things out, and try to gain some sort of mastery with draftsmanship. And then I got to a point where I didn't really want to develop that specific uh, like skill in terms of like rendering things out anymore. It became less interesting to me. But at that point, I was already like the obsession had set in. So when I started this journey at drawing again, I wanted to like kind of handicap myself. So I started using different instruments to try to back away from it a little bit. I'm not like doing a great job at it, but I was using more like blunt instruments. Like this one specifically is all oil bars, or I'll use like a drawing tool extended on like a stick or something, anything to kind of back away from it a little bit more and not obsess about the things that I used to obsess about.
Well,
It just,
it's funny that you say that because sort of like in the highbrow fine art world, and I did my undergrad in Los Angeles, and there was always this sort of aestheticizing Los Angeles artists in the fine art world as having this finish fetish, you know, things of having this like this perfect rendered
Mhm.
appeal to them, as opposed to like New York ab X sort of, you know, free for all kind of way. And so it's interesting that sort of led into also the aesthetic of the graffiti world as well.
Oh yeah,
Like there's like
absolutely.
there's absolutely like a relationship there.
Yeah, there's all these regional, relationships. Like when I first came up here to the Bay Area, even though I have a lot of, graffiti family here in the Bay, I was largely like, man, what's going on with all this ugly graffiti? But it was, it was part of the style. It was part of the way people, approach their work. So, um, but that's, clearly a whole different conversation.
um I guess we
Want to
can
open it up, Anna, or do you want
we
to?
can open it up.
Yeah,
I
let's
mean,
put the feelers out.
I have more questions, but I think maybe it's we
If
can go down
anybody,
to the last image.
sure. Yeah, I think if anybody has any questions, feel free to pose them. Or if you're shy, you can type them in the chat. You can ask them. If there's not a lot of interest in extra questions, we have more questions too. So
Well, I mean, I don't,
you have questions for us, Pablo? Pablo, you have questions for
I
us?
might have some questions. I might have some questions.
Do you have questions about your own work now that you've talked to us?
I don't know. Well, I do actually, but the artist doesn't answer them very well, so I probably won't ask. This last painting, I actually did in graduate school, and is part of a collection. Cheech Marin, the actor comedian.
Of
He
Cheech and Chong fame.
That's correct. So this is now part of his collection, which I think will be featured in this new museum that he's opening
Yep.
this year.
Yep.
It keeps getting pushed back. There is signs of motion. I believe it may open in the fall. That's the word, but we'll see. So yeah, if you're ever in LA, it's actually going to be in Riverside, just outside of Los Angeles. This painting should be part of that.
They do reference his collection as one of the most important collection of Latino art. And I guess one of the things that Kelly and I were discussing when we were discussing your work is this idea of what are your feelings about being sort of labeled a Latino artist or a Chicano artist? And then I guess a follow-up question to that is what's the difference between a Latino and a Chicano artist? And then the follow-up to that would be, do you want to have that clarifying statement attached to you, or would you prefer to just be Pablo Cristi, the artist?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is probably more complicated than clear.
Yeah.
So I think right off the bat, I think myself personally, and I could probably speak for a lot of people in a position like mine. I want to be known just as an artist, Pablo Cristi, an artist. But I also know how extremely important representation is, especially in what's been predominantly a white dominated space. So I know how important it is for me before I was an artist to see people like me or even remotely close to me from maybe other communities, but people that may have not been traditionally represented in this fine art world. So, but like a lot of that you can see just in the work itself, like how people are titled by others, because these are titles that I don't necessarily give myself. They're titles that are given to me.
Right.
So, and like if we talk about like Cheech Marin, like one of his phrases that he uses a lot is that Chicano art is American art. So like, is there a need to have these labels? At the end of the day, we're artists, and at least myself, I'm an American artist, and so, I think it's like I said, it's a complicated thing
It's a
there because
complicated time too for these issues right
that's right.
now, especially.
Well, I think the problem though is that a lot of times you get pigeonholed into this hierarchical system
Yeah.
where if you're like say a Latino artist or a Chicano artist, it's more akin to like being like kind of like a folk artist. So you start like falling down this sort of like hierarchy of
Yeah.
what's considered more valuable or more important. And that's where like I think the
And
problems
there's,
really happen.
yeah, and there's really not, it's not a lot of one amazing and really influential Latin American artists are not talked about or learn, you're not schooled about them when you're in graduate school or undergraduate in fine arts programs. It's just like, oh, we invented minimalism. It's like, no, have you been to South America? That's just
Right,
not the case. Like
right.
there's so much work that's from Latin American artists that is just, yeah, it's not talked about.
That's right.
I think, you know, Mexico City has done like a fantastic job of really pulling to the fore of, you know, becoming one of the epicenters of
Oh,
the
absolutely.
art world without having to say this is the Latin American art world. It's the art world, and we have Mexican artists, and we have artists from all over Europe and all
That's right.
over the world, and you know, and they're now like an epicenter. You know, I think Bogota is starting to do the same. You know, it's branching out to places. You know, and obviously Sao Paulo and Rio, and you know, some
That's right.
degree Buenos Aires, but you know,
Oh no, I mean there's a lot of places.
Santiago.
But I
But
think a large part of what you're talking about and what we're talking about here is this kind of dominant narrative. You know, it's like it kind of relates right back to the work and sort of the intention behind it is
mhm,
questioning this dominant narrative and really
absolutely,
and taking ownership, you know, of and being able to use the platforms that we have. You know, I myself have a great privilege of having a platform. So bringing these things to the forefront and having spaces like this to talk about it, um, you know, really helps contribute to hopefully I hopefully and the intention is to create a more equitable place and a better world for all of us. And so but you know that's at the center of what you're talking about right there in that comment and then also just in the work that I make. So
absolutely. Um, a little bit more, just uh, when you